Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today, we are back with Professor Scully from Emory University, and we're going to be talking about Sara Baartman.
Oh, okay. Let's get into this.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
Brooke, have you ever heard of Sara Baartman?
Nope.
Okay. Outstanding.
I know you're surprised.
No, I mean, she's a really interesting example of the way that white and European views of body image impacted colonial peoples in defining what is beautiful and sort of making it difficult for someone who's not
Of what their expectations are.
Yeah, to feel beautiful. So Sara Baartman was brought to European stages from Africa and displayed as sort of a freak in a freak show that would travel around, and she was incredibly famous. I don't really know how to gently talk about this, but like she has a really big bottom, and that was like what was the freak show about it.
Oh.
And, you know, big by European standards. And so she was, you know, displayed and
Was she a woman of color or a white woman?
She's a woman of color, and she's like this spectacle on a stage for European audiences.
And what time period is this?
So she lived between 1789 and 1815, and she was under the sort of stage name Hottentot Venus. The Venus, you know, figurines were, you know, female bodies and shapes and whatever.
That makes sense. So around the same time as like the Barnum and Bailey freak shows and like those sort of things.
Oh, that's a little later, but yeah. And
so people would come as an attraction to see these things and oddities. I mean, they're not going to print them in the newspaper. You have to go to the show.
Right, exactly.
Interesting. And so what are we talking about with the professor is about her in particular?
Yeah, about her and about the larger like meaning and context of these types of shows. So
and like impact that I'm sure they had.
Oh yeah, on perceptions of, you know, and
beauty and idols.
Othering, you know, like because you take, you know, kind of an extreme example out of any society and you put it on display, and it, you know, distorts the perception that like these people are so different from us.
It's like talking about aliens in some way, shape, and form. It's like other. It's like all the things. Yeah. How dehumanizing that experience must have been. So do we
sexualizing like many things. Yeah. So I'm really excited to get into this.
Oh, me too. Let's let her introduce herself.
I'm Professor Pamela Scully. I have a PhD in history from the University of Michigan, and I'm a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies and African studies at Emory University.
I think we might have a problem because my grandfather went to Michigan State, and I hear I'm just teasing.
I'm sorry about what's the latest at Michigan State.
Oh, I know, right?
You'll be fine.
You'll be fine, yeah. But anyway, I'm so grateful to have you here. And I'm especially excited to expand my own knowledge and secondary teachers' knowledge of African history. And so today we're going to talk about Sara Baartman, and I cannot wait. Why do you think this is such an important topic for teachers to bring into the classroom?
There are so many reasons. I'll start by just saying who she was. So Sara Baartman was an African woman born in about the 1770s in the frontier region of South Africa in the Cape Colony, and she died in Paris in 1815. After having been displayed on stages in London, Ireland, and finally Paris as a joke, inverted commas, known as the Hottentot Venus. And the supposed joke was she couldn't be someone they called a Hottentot, which is a pejorative name for indigenous hunter-gatherers in South Africa, now known as the San, the Khoi, etc. She couldn't both be quote-unquote Hottentot as well as a Venus, a woman who could be desired. And so she was displayed as a joke on stages. And people like Dickens, Darwin, Victor Hugo, Freud, Picasso, H.G. Wells, and James Joyce all knew of her or wrote about her. And her remains, after she died, and were kept in the Musée de l'Homme, the Museum of Man in Paris, for over a century into the 70s. But her remains were finally returned to South Africa when democracy came, the end of apartheid. And she was buried on National Women's Day in August of 2002.
Oh, recently.
Oh, recently, yes, very recently. So I think...
Where were her remains prior to that? In Europe?
They were in the museum in France, and there actually had to be a whole debate in the French Senate as to whether her remains could be returned to South Africa, because anyway, it was complicated. And so I think, as you can even hear from the trajectory of her life, her life really raises complex questions about the relationship between racism and science, colonial and metropolitan histories, the experience of Black women in the early 19th century and beyond. And then many people who've written about her have not been historians. They've been cultural critics, cultural studies, Black studies. Not that those can't also be historians, but generally they have not been historians. And so there's a lot of interest in her life and the way she became a kind of cultural icon for racism. And also, I think she's a really interesting and important person for students to learn about. And I think interesting for teachers to teach about, because I think she does, first introduce students to a woman who lived an incredible and tragic transnational life in colonial South Africa, the United Kingdom, and Paris in the late 18th, 19th century. And through that life, we come to understand something about slavery, urbanization, the Black experience across the British Empire, and in ways that resonate a lot with American history. She also, Sara Baartman, became entangled in the lives and the works of leading figures in comparative anatomy, like Georges Cuvier, who founded comparative anatomy, and her body literally became the foundation of scientific racism, because he examined her body to see whether it was a connection between animals and people. So, and then wrote up number of scientific experiments. So it's not a metaphor. Her body literally was actually the foundation for racial science. It's also a very depressing story, as you can hear, but it is also an uplifting story about one woman who's remembered by her society in South Africa nearly 200 years after her death, and that democracy matters because it was only because of democracy coming to South Africa finally after, extended colonial era, I guess you could call it, that her body was returned. So there's something there also about memory and remembering and honoring people who've died many, many years ago. And also for, history classes, I think learning more about her is also a chance to think about facts and historical narrative, because one of the things that's interesting about her life and the way it's been narrated by various people is that various things have been repeated as truths, which actually for example, I wrote a book about her with a colleague, Clifton Craze, turned out not to be true when you actually went to the historical record. So it's very interesting to see also how certain truths get kind of reproduced as truths just because it's what we want to believe or we think, or because of an error in some original interpretation. So it's an interesting topic, I think, for students to learn about and to wrestle with the meanings of history and facts and how we think about representing the lives of people who lived a long time ago.
It sounds like from that list, she fits whatever subject history teachers are teaching about.
Yes, it really, because also the way she was displayed in London, in Piccadilly Circus, very famous place, the place every tourist goes, was very much also part of a whole tradition of freak shows, which conversations in American history to be had even around the circus and Barnum and things like that. So her life is interesting because it exposes us to the way that people did a kind of entertainment in the 19th century that we are now horrified by, which wasn't necessarily considered horrifying. And yet, even as we're appreciating that, we're also having to appreciate what it was like for her to be a Black woman in London, and when there were very few Black people in London. There was a community, and then again, her life became involved in the anti-slavery movement in London because some anti-slavery activists became interested in her being displayed because they felt that violated certain rulings that had been made about that you could not have enslaved people in London. And then it's also complicated because at least one of those anti-slavery activists actually had connections to plantation slavery, as in he'd been a manager on a plantation in the British Caribbean and was engaged in some rather nefarious activities on the west coast of Africa. So her whole life makes easy discussions of evil and good challenging, which of course is the point why history is so interesting, because people themselves are complex and don't always fit into easy buckets. But what I would most, want, I guess, students to think about when they see her life is both that she was a woman who also had children. We discovered she had at least 2 children. They died when they were young, but she had children, she had partners, she had an emotional life, and also to think about how that person life was overwhelmed by racism.
Yeah, that's powerful. So it sounds like there are many sources and well-known sources whose writings would be very easily findable. You mentioned Sigmund Freud. There are, it seems like, legal documents. The French Senate has to have conversations about this. So I'm just thinking like, oh my gosh, there's enough here to make, a inquiry or a DBQ or something for students to investigate.
Oh, for sure. Well, I thought about, there's also secondary sources, but let me, in terms of primary sources that teachers could use. And again, there's so many ways one could go about this. First, there are 2 poems, one by Elizabeth Alexander called The Venus Hottentot, which I'll just read you the first few lines. Science, science, science. Everything is beautiful, blown up beneath my glass. And this is Cuvier supposedly talking, the man who examined her. Colors dazzle insect wings, a drop of water swirls, etc., etc. Cranial measurements crowd my notebook pages, etc., etc. Her genitals will float inside a labeled pickling jar in the Musée de l'Homme on a shelf above Broca's brain, the Venus Hottentot. And so it goes. And then the second part is purportedly Sara Baartman. There's an unexpected sun today in London, and the clouds that most days sift into this cage where I'm working have dispersed. I'm a black cutout against a captive blue sky, pivoting nude so the paying audience can view my naked buttons. So it's a very powerful poem. And then, so there's that poem. And then there's a poem that was written by a woman called Diane Ferris, who wrote this poem around the time that the debates about whether Sara Baartman's body could be returned to South Africa. She is South African, Black South African writer, poet, and storyteller of Khoisan ancestry, so of the same community in a large sense that Sara Baartman was from. And she wrote a poem called I've Come to Take You Home in 1998. And I'll just read you the first lines. Remember the veldt, the lush green grass beneath the big oak trees. The air is cool there and the sun does not burn. I've made your bed at the foot of the hill. Your blankets are covered in buchu and mint. The protea stand in yellow and white, and the water in the stream chuckles, sings songs as it hobbles along over the little stones. So just right there, you could use the poems as launching pads to discuss Sara Baartman's life, how different people have represented it. Anyway, and you can see it's really, really moving. There are also there is a whole bunch of primary evidence. So, for example, if you just Google, there are images of the quote-unquote Hottentot Venus and Sara Baartman all over. And you can see cartoons were drawn of her, prints were made of her, there were advertisements of her display in Piccadilly. So just numerous visual references. There are also tax records in Cape Town, which is what we use to find out where she lived and where she lived in Cape Town. So there's and the interviews with her, there's an interview with her in London, which has to be contextualized because the man who was keeping her somewhat prisoner, Dunlop, was actually in the room. So she wasn't if she was ever a free agent, she certainly wasn't there. And I don't think she was really ever a free agent, obviously. The newspaper records, the scientific papers by Cuvier. So in terms of primary sources, there are just tons of things. And then just in terms of the secondary sources that a teacher could use to kind of, orientate themselves to it. I did work on the Wikipedia page as part of a collaboration with a group out of Switzerland, I think it was, who were trying to democratize and make sure that Indigenous representations were accurate. And so the Wikipedia page is pretty accurate. I will just say that one of the issues that gets reproduced all the time is that she was born in 1789. Which any historian should be a little that sounds very close to the French Revolution. And it turns out that she was not born in 1789. She was much more likely born in the late 1770s. But the Wikipedia page, as many other things, just starts with 1789 because that's what's always been said. It's not accurate. In terms of the book, we wrote a book, Sara Baartman and the Hottentot Venus, a ghost story and a biography with Princeton that discusses Sara Baartman's life. There's a nice video called The Life and Times of Sara Baartman, which reproduces some of the older eras, but is I think a very good video to talk with students about and is empathetic, and I like it a lot. Stephen Jay Gould wrote about her in The Mismeasure of Man and The Flamingos File, which concentrates on science. And there's a very nice book by Janelle Hobson called Venus in the Dark, Blackness and Beauty in Popular Culture. I like it on sort of thinking about how Sara Baartman's body and the image of the Hottentot Venus kind of continues into popular culture in various ways. And then there are there are a whole bunch of other articles by Sadia Qureshi, by Zina Magubane, which I could, certainly help people reference. Yeah. So there's a lot.
There's a lot. One of the things that's interesting, though, that I haven't heard you say is things that she wrote or said, recorded. So are there no interviews with her?
There are. There's one interview, but one of the things we were arguing about in our book, Sara Baartman and the Hottentot Venus, and the subtitle is Biography and a Ghost Story, was to say that it's easier to write the biography of the image and the symbol of the Hottentot Venus than it is to actually write about Sara Baartman. She was a poor Black woman. She wasn't enslaved because there were technicalities about who could be enslaved in South Africa at the time, but she lived might as well have been enslaved. She lived in conditions of servitude for sure. So she was a Black woman in South Africa in a colonial era who, as far as we know, was not literate. The people who are generally the topics of biography are, men who left their diaries or women who wrote, their diaries, not poor Black women from a long time ago. And so part of what the challenge of writing about her life, which we really want to take her life seriously, was to find the evidence of her, even if she hadn't written about it. There is into this interview done when the Anti-Slavery Society in London wanted to find out if she was being, in fact, kept as a slave in Piccadilly. But it's, again, complex. She was interviewed when, as I was saying, Dunlop, who was the, I would say, bad guy in the story, one of them, who brought her to London, was in the room. So she could not speak freely. Also, she spoke in Dutch, and it was translated into English through an interpreter. So it's already one step removed. And then Dutch was not her home language. So it's already, multiple steps removed. And so she said in that interview that she was happy in London and that she had 2 Black boys to ride in a carriage with her on the weekends or once a week, and that she was fine, and that Dunlop was paying her, all of which one should be a little skeptical about. This is a controversial point that we made in our book, but we really wanted to think about her as someone who lived and died without bringing to her experience what we now know, which is that her body did become the foundation of racial science. But she had been in Cape Town. Her partner had to leave because he was a member of a navy, and so he had to leave. Her child had died, and she was sort of stuck in Cape Town. So, maybe being in London was better than being in Cape Town, and it seems like she was displayed in both places. So it's not to go rah, she had a lovely life. It's none of that. We don't know in that interview what was coerced, what was not coerced, but we should assume that she was not a free agent to say really what she thought. So I think even reading that court case, which is, available, would be a really interesting thing to do in a class, because you would have to engage with the kind of complexity of some of the anti-slavery leaders. You could talk a little bit about the anti-slavery movement in Britain, and you could compare it with the States. You could talk about how the law came to kind of be so important, and that it was absolutely taken as valid that she was talking freely and able to talk, which is paradox given the initial investigation. But I think that itself would be a very good primary document to get students engaged with.
Yeah, it sounds like a really good example of, one, it's hard in women's history when you have these few women who become exemplars for the conditions of women in, X circumstance. But it sounds like she is a good exemplar and maybe an exceptional exemplar for the life of a woman who's quote unquote not a slave living in Britain during this time. And it's hard because as much as that's interesting to me, I also think about how being on the stage is an empowering thing, but yet she's here to be mocked, right? To be laughed at. And I would love, to have that source that tells you what that felt like to day in, day out, get up on stage and be laughed at. And, there are exercises that you can do with students in the classroom where you describe the context to someone's experience. And you don't insert what you think that person would have thought or felt, and let the students write and reflect on, if we had a source from her that wasn't coerced, that wasn't, whatever, and let them write about it and see. I imagine you could have 20 students in the room and a variety of perspectives, but I also think that there would be some commonalities between those perspectives and those commonalities might be close to the truth.
Yeah, and I think that would be fabulous. I should say in our book, we had to do some imagining just because precisely, that was not there. So we did, and actually I wrote that chapter, but just sort of thinking about, okay, so how might she, staring out at the audience, see these people gawking at her, and how did it feel to be poked and prodded and people could pay more money and touch her? And history is such a lesson in empathy. It forces us to try and empathize and understand what it's like to be someone from a long time ago in certain situations. And I think that what you've just said would be a really interesting thing to do with students. Yeah.
And it looks like that's what you all had to do. So where can people find your book? Because I think
it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. Amazon.
It's everywhere you'll find it.
We'll make sure it's in the show notes for people so that you can get it and read more.
One thing, can I just end by saying a few more things about how one could approach her in terms of classrooms?
Please.
One could watch, so one could do the film, look at those two poems, but one could also, watch the film, which is really quite moving, and discuss how she was caught up in colonialism and the rise of racial science. And I think that's quite an accessible film. I think one could look at, if you wanted, as a history teacher, want to look more at sources or how historians have narrated the past, you could look at the writings about her from the 1940s through the 2000s and see how the way people wrote about her changed. I mean, in the 40s, she was very much an object. I mean, people wrote about her as if she was just yet another object, so this. And then I think, one could also see how errors are compounded over time and looking at how, the birth is asserted 1789, the assertions about the fact that one of the men who took her to London was a Dutch white colonial racist. But in fact, the records show that he wasn't. He was actually of slave descent. He was actually, quote, quote, what's known in South Africa as free black in those era. So he wasn't a nasty colonialist. He was, in fact, someone descended from enslaved people. But that got compounded in all the narratives. So it is an interesting case to also just examine how historians write, what gets reproduced over time, and the importance of going back to the historical record. Okay, then. And thank you. This has been a real pleasure. I really appreciated it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. The fact that there are films that people can show in the class too that help bring this to life. I also think the connections you've made into racial science, quote unquote, I think is really powerful and helps us question all the stereotypes that people have about different groups of people. And I have tried really hard to bring some of these what I perceive as graduate level concepts into my secondary classroom. And it's hard to do, but I think if you take it with one individual woman, what a powerful way to make something that is so complex, really objective and simplified and very clear. Let's take this and apply it to this one woman's lived experience. Well, Pamela, thank you so much for today. I am so grateful. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.